Yeah. Good evening. I think I start. Good evening. I wish you a very warm welcome on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Budapest. I would have loved to meet you all in person here in Budapest, but this is another online event, but I hope you don't leave us too early. I'm very pleased that we will have another event tonight together as a part of the series Visions for Europe in cooperation with Professor Kreft and the Andrássy University here in Budapest. We started this series of discussions last year, and the last topic we had was Europe's self-assertion in tomorrow's world with Katharina Barley. Of course, today, as we are very few days before the Hungarian elections on Sunday, this would have been a nice topic as well, but today we are concentrating on a topic which is so essential right now in these days, Russia's attack on Ukraine and what it means for European security architecture. For FES, the European Common Foreign and Security Policy is of major importance. For that, we opened a few years ago the FES Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace in Europe in Vienna, and its goal is to come to terms with the challenges of peace and security in Europe since the collapse of the Soviet Union. These issues are being discussed primarily with the countries of Eastern Europe, with Russia, when it's possible, as well, of course, with the countries of the EU and the United States. It's about regional and international meetings for developing concepts on cooperation and peace in Europe, creating a regional network of young professionals in the field of cooperation and peace in Europe, and also cooperation with the OSCE in 3 dimensions: the political, military, the economic, and the human. Now, honestly, despite all the analysis of think tanks, politicians, etc., who imagined a war in Europe with a Russian aggressor? What went wrong to experience a war like this, which is still going on today since more than a month now? Was Putin so wrongly informed by his team, despite all the Russian espionage, which seems to be ongoing in many European countries? One important question remains: how to put an end to this military fighting, how to resolve the conflicts and create a basis for a sustainable peace. Which security architecture do we need in future to avoid coming so close again to a third world war and to a possible use of nuclear weapons? The beginning of this war has sent shock waves through the Western world and changed the government agenda of all countries, including the newly elected German government. The already scheduled socio-ecological transformation was pushed into the background in favor of new political priorities regarding arms, defense capacities, and strategic cooperation among a unified EU, NATO, and other allies, as we've seen during the last few weeks at all international summits, and there were many. For the first time, the 27 member states of the European Union have formulated their security interests in a joint concept called Strategic Compass, launched last week at a Council summit. 3 years ago, when the idea for a strategic compass was being touted by French and German EU diplomats, isolationist President Donald Trump was still in the White House, imagine, and French President Emmanuel Macron famously declared the NATO as brain dead. But today, the situation in Europe has radically changed. So President Macron says now that Russia has given us a wake-up call, attacking the Ukraine, sort of an electric shock. Now, the strategic compass pinpoints which steps need to be taken over the next 3 years to make the EU stronger and more independent. Europe must learn to speak the language of power, the EU Foreign Affairs Representative Josep Borrell said, and he described it as a turning point for the European Union as a security provider and an important step for the European security and defense policy. And he said, this is only the beginning. Now, I know this is not the first concept of its kind, but let's hope that this one will be really effective. It takes in its various chapters, a sweeping look around the entire globe and takes all issues into consideration, including cyber war and name it. Well, tonight we will have a unique opportunity to discuss all these issues with Nathalie Tocci and Andrássy. And I'm really happy that we have this evening together. And with this, I hand over to Dr. Kreff, wishing all of you an enlightening discussion. Thank you and have a nice evening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Beate Martin, and a very warm welcome also from my side. I'm Heinrich Kreff. I'm holding the chair for diplomacy here at Andrássy University in Budapest, and a great thank you to you, Beate Martin, and the Office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for supporting our series. We have already had a couple of events last winter semester, and we started all this last summer semester when Europe looked very differently. Well, the recent major Russian offensive, which began on February 24th, after 7 years of frozen conflict, has shocked Europe, has shocked NATO, has shocked all of us. It has triggered extraordinary international reactions that are likely to completely reshape the geopolitical reality in Europe. This change must have come as a shock to many, including the Russians, including Putin. Germany has announced, as Beate already mentioned, an extreme reshaping of its foreign and security policy, sending lethal weapons to Ukraine and announcing a drastic increase in its military budget. The EU has decided to support Ukraine as well with lethal military aid. Could this spark a debate on the supranationalization of CFSP? Current events have reinvigorated domestic debates in Finland and Sweden about possible NATO accession, though I don't think that this is very likely. The escalation also has demonstrated the great geopolitical importance of Eastern European countries, and it has underlined again the indispensability of the United States as NATO's anchor country and Europe's protecting power. The only thing that is certain today is that the future security architecture will look very different than what we knew before February 24th. A great thank you to Nathalie and a great thank you to Andrássy for joining us tonight as speakers and to comment on the impact of this unprovoked Russian attack on Ukraine, on the EU, and the future of European security architecture. You probably have read all the CVs of Nathalie and of Andrássy, so I would like to highlight just a few things. Nathalie is director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. She has been special advisor to the EU High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Joseph Borrell, and she has been special advisor to his predecessor, Federica Mogherini, and she wrote during that time the European Global Strategy and worked on its implementation. Andrássy is an associate fellow at the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik, the German Council on Foreign Relations, and its security and defense program. He's also a research fellow here at NKE in Budapest. And above all, he's a great expert on Eastern European and Russian affairs. Nathalie will speak for 20 minutes, followed by Andrássy for another 20 minutes, and then I will kick it off immediately open to all of you, to all of your questions and to all of your comments. And I hope that I can include as many as possible. And now I would like to give the floor to Nathalie. Nathalie, please take the floor.
Well, thank you so much for this, Henrik. And indeed, it's a real pleasure for me to be here. It's a real pleasure to also have this conversation, albeit virtually. quote unquote, in Budapest. I mean, I'm not in Budapest, I'm sitting in Rome, but nonetheless, given that you are at such, you know, literally almost on the eve of such an important potential turning point in Hungary, it's a real pleasure for me to have this conversation, which I'm sure will also connect with much of the thinking in Hungary concerning where the country itself is going to be heading. And in trying to sort of figure out what angle to look at this, I just kind of I thought to myself, you know, sort of how is it that we can understand today where European security is headed, given where and what we have come from, and I think it's useful to sort of divide almost time periods up into three blocks. You know, I think that, and here obviously I'm talking, you know, from end of the Cold War till where we are today. You know, I think if you kind of look at the period which essentially went from 1991 through to 2008, I think that is, you know, 2007, 2008, I think that is, you know, the first important turning point, which I think now we see with greater clarity, with, you know, compared to what we did back then. But that first phase was, you know, we can almost call it an age of idealism. I mean, this was the heyday of the liberal international order. This was the time in which we thought of European security as the construction of a space of cooperation and interdependence and trade and shared security from Lisbon to Vladivostok. This was a time of enlargement. You know, it was a time of EU enlargement. It was a time of NATO enlargement. And even with respect to Russia, it was a time in which the understanding of security really hinged upon the notion that our norms, our values would somehow diffuse. I mean, you know, no one obviously ever thought about the enlargement, well, some did, but no one seriously thought about the enlargement of NATO or the European Union to Russia. But there was this sense that through, let me call them enlargement light type policies, you know, sort of these would diffuse all the way through Russia through to Russia as well. There was also, I think, you know, sort of coupled with this, if you like, political idealism, there was also a very strong sense of market-driven idealism, and this was really kind of, you know, two sides of the same coin, you know, and hence the idea that interdependence would automatically almost lead to peace, or at the very least, it will lead to a mitigation of conflict, and therefore interdependence was a good to be fostered. And interdependence in all fields, and of course, when it comes to the EU-Russia relationship, the main form of interdependence, which was, of course, an energy-related one. And of course, there were all sorts of reasons why this was the case, and some of which dated back to the Cold War, and the idea that even when the tensions are there, even when conflicts, in fact, are there, somehow interdependence can survive. It can be shielded from political turmoil, and it can become that bedrock that even if and when the going gets rough, can create those common bonds, in a sense, tying us together. Now, I think, you know, underpinning that age of idealism, there was, of course, you know, a good dose of hubris as well. But I think there was a genuine belief, because I think, as I said, this was not just Europe. This was really part of a much broader international order, in which, you know, the Cold War had ended in a particular way. And there was a general sense that this essentially, I mean, we were living in the age of an end of history. Now, that age ended, I would say, you know, I think the turning point in retrospect is around 2007, 2008, 2009, in different ways, by the way. I think, you know, economically speaking, you know, we're talking about the global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and therefore the beginning of an age of multipolarity, at least in economic terms, perhaps not necessarily in a sense, security and defense terms. In Europe, of course, that was an important turning point, particularly if we think of Georgia being front and center of our minds. But round about then, and of course that moment started really clarifying, particularly in Europe after 2014, and therefore after the annexation of Ukraine, war in the annexation of Crimea, war in eastern Ukraine. I would define this second age, which basically goes from, as I say, 2007, 2008 through to 2022. I would define this as an age of pragmatism. And what do I mean by an age of pragmatism? I think that there was an understanding that indeed we no longer, a growing understanding that indeed we no longer lived in that wonderful liberal international order in which norms and rules and values would automatically diffuse, and because the rest of the world simply wanted to become like us, and all we had to do was encourage and support, perhaps a little times coerce the rest of the world to become like us. I think beginning in that age of pragmatism, we started understanding that world was going. It was indeed an age of multipolarity, an age in which liberal norms coexisted with illiberal norms, in which power was shifting, it was diffusing beyond the West as well, and therefore beyond Europe as well, and in which the relationship with Russia was becoming an increasingly tense and conflictual one. Now, that pragmatism meant that we were no longer starry-eyed about that notion of a shared space of cooperation from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and hence we woke up to the reality that given the annexation of Crimea, given the war in eastern Ukraine, sanctions had to be imposed, and therefore the route of sanctions was embarked upon. But pragmatism also cut the other and the opposite way. So there was also a pragmatism that told us that, hey, we don't like Russia, but the world is big, bad, and ugly, and we've got to come to terms with it. And therefore, that pragmatism also means that we need to find forms of engagement with Russia, and forms of perhaps, as we wrote it back, in the day of the global strategy, we need to find forms of selective engagement of Russia. Let's look at where interests coincide, and let's work together on those areas in order to pragmatically sort of live in a world where we pragmatically impose sanctions, but we also pragmatically seek ways of selectively engaging. And whether that selective engagement is on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, whether it's on the Middle East peace process, whether it's on energy, and whether it's on climate. And of course, climate was perhaps, as the other agenda items, as time went by and the relationship with Russia became increasingly complex and increasingly tense, you basically start seeing that the agenda of selective engagement starts narrowing and narrowing and narrowing and narrowing up until the point, which I think was essentially last year, in which kind of climate was the only thing that we had left. And we had climate left much in the same way as climate was identified in the growing confrontation between the United States and China as the only area of possible and in fact necessary cooperation. And hence the line between the US and China was, we compete on everything but not on climate. And this was really the narrative that drove, I'm not quite sure how successfully, but it drove the movement, if you like, to Glasgow of last year. And much the same thinking, I think, also imbued the European and to an extent Russian thinking in terms of the European-Russian relationship as well. So basically, if you like, you have this age of pragmatism that starts narrowing up until the point where we enter the third and hopefully not final stage, which I would really define as an age of war. Now, what do I mean by an age of war beyond the obvious kind of meaning of it, that there is a war in Ukraine? What I mean by an age of war is actually something even more dramatic than this. I think that the paradigm that we have moved already in is the shift from a post-war paradigm to a pre-war paradigm. meaning a shift from a post-Second World War paradigm to a pre-World War, hopefully not Third World War, but the risk is obviously there. Pre doesn't necessarily mean that you actually get to it, but I think that that is the paradigm shift that we're in, which is what makes the order, or rather the disorder underpinning European security fundamentally different also what existed, let alone, you know, in the post-Cold War era, but even during the Cold War, because I think it's important to recognize that the Cold War was fought between adversaries that were on the same side of the hot war. This is not the case today. And so the way in which this can somehow settle, even if tomorrow morning there is an agreement, which of course there won't be, in and on Ukraine, that this can somehow settle into a new Iron Curtain of sorts, I personally just cannot see this happening. You know, even that scenario, which is certainly not a rosy scenario, I think it is far rosier than what I can conceive of. And this is why I would define the age that we have entered as an age of essentially of war. Now, what are the implications for this of this age of war, particularly as far as Europe is concerned? And I think here, you know, I would also love, you know, any reflections that you may have when we have a discussion in terms of where also this leaves Hungary itself. You know, I think that in many respects, this, you know, what has happened and what has been happening since the 24th of February has already led to a very significant step change in terms of where we are in Europe, where we are in European integration. And let me perhaps just highlight a few areas where I think that is the case. The first, which is not a policy point, it's rather a political point, which I think to an extent was already, in a sense, you know, it had already emerged over the course of the pandemic, is really the rediscovery of a magic little word that is and lies at the heart of European integration, which is called solidarity. And the sense that we're in this together. We may not necessarily always agree with one another. We certainly perhaps don't even like one another, but hey, we don't really have a choice. We've got to live with one another because there is a world out there that is big, bad, and ugly, and we have war on the European continent, or we have a pandemic sweeping across our world. And therefore, in order to sort of, you know, navigate this world, we've got to stick together. These used to be words. I think first over the course of the pandemic, and now in a very dramatic way with this war, it has really led politically to a sense of unity, including amongst countries like Hungary, you know, like Poland, that was certainly not, you know, kind of out there on the front line in terms of, you know, Europe and European integration. And, you know, I'd be fascinated to hear to what extent this is something that is, I mean, looking at it from outside is what I perceive, but I'd love to hear actually your views as to what extent this is something that you feel particularly in Hungary. So I think that's the sort of political premise of everything, you know, the other points that I wanted to mention. And then I'll stop. I'll just mention four. The first, of course, is defense. Now, this again, you know, it's not something that began with the 24th of February, but in fairness, you know, between, I would say, 2015, 2016, particularly 2016 to 2017, I would say, in that period, there was the sense of, you know, here we are, we're going to build a security and defense union, and therefore we established PESCO and an MPCC and CARD and a European Defense Fund and a European Peace Facility, and we established all of these instruments, but we didn't really use them. Here we are in a situation where war is here. I mean, war is on the European continent, and I think it's a very significant move that all of a sudden, over the course of a couple of weeks, you have the European Union spending over 1 billion to support the armed defense of a third country, namely Ukraine. Now, this does not mean that we're on the cusp of the establishment of a European army, but I think it does mean that, in a sense, a really important taboo in Europe has been broken in terms of Europe not only talking about defense, but actually doing defense. Now, how exactly this is going to settle, I don't know, in the sense that you also see a very strong reinvigoration of NATO. And how exactly is this European defense effort going to blend with a reinvigorated NATO? I do not know. My hunch is that this is going to go in the direction of a NATO which is going to remain the operational center, if you like, of where defense, including European defense, is done. But the European Union can become a key, an important actor, particularly when it comes to the funding side of this, when it comes to the industrial side of all of this. And of course, we know that capacities and the capacity side and the operational side really need to work together. Which I think the implicit side note to all of this, I mean, sort of Beate was mentioning the compass. I think that there are elements in that document that attracted quite a bit of attention. I personally don't think that those are the most interesting bits. I don't hold my breath for a European rapid defense capacity. I do think that there are some quite interesting elements in that document concerning VAT waivers and, concerning some sort of fairly technical measures that can actually be quite significant when it comes to moving forward in terms of capacities on defense. Second point, migration, another sort of pet subject in Hungary. But all of a sudden, here we are activating the temporary protection directive. What are the implications of that in terms of actually making this something more systemic over time? A bit like in the whole debate over the pandemic and Next Generation EU, to what extent is Next Generation EU something that could eventually become more systemic in terms of debt mutualization? We're not there yet, but I think an important seed has already been sown when it comes to a common European asylum and migration policy. Third aspect is energy and the whole notion of energy, European energy independence. I think it's important to recognize that, particularly because, in a sense, as we moved from an age of idealism into an age of pragmatism, when it came to energy, we were actually not pragmatic enough, meaning that we were pragmatic in the sense of just keep on doing business, but not pragmatic enough in terms of not recognizing the fact that we had moved from that age of idealism into an age of pragmatism. And in retrospect, if you think of it, it's absolutely absurd, right? That not only did our dependence on Russia not reduce in those years, but it actually increased in those years. Now, I've been asking myself the question, why was that the case? How did this happen? This was happening, that gradual increase in our dependence on Russia was actually happening after the annexation of Crimea, after what was happening in Eastern, after the election meddling in our countries, after the disinformation campaigns. How is it possible? How did it happen? And beyond inertia, and there are all sorts of, I think, possible explanations to this. But I think a key element of this explanation also has to do with the illusion that, on the one hand, markets were simply going to do the trick. I mean, all we had to do was create a space for markets to operate. But I think that notion was poisoned by, or not poisoned, poison is the wrong word. It was kind of deviated by the fact that precisely between 2014 and 6 months ago, energy prices were very low. And when energy prices are low, in an interdependent relationship like the EU-Russia energy relationship, when prices are low, leverage is on the buyer's side. When prices are high, leverage is on the seller's side. And we assumed that the prices were going to remain low forever, because we were moving into an energy transition. And in an energy transition, demand for fossil fuels goes down, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to say here, that on the energy front, although we had in security terms moved into an age of pragmatism, I think the idealism from the previous era continued to permeate, perhaps conveniently, a lot of our thinking. And so here we are waking for the, sort of waking up to the harsh reality that the world does not quite work like this. And we're scrambling. And I think, now we're at a juncture in which, and it will not be easy to do, but I think it's necessary to do. Energy security is very much back into the debate. I mean, we had forgotten about energy security. If 6 months ago you used the word diversification, you were not even allowed to use it, because diversification was diversification of fossil sources, and that was bad. So all of a sudden energy security is back in a very prominent way. What we will have to do is, and I think this is essential, in fact it's existential, is find, not only in narrative terms, but in practical terms, ways to actually make this blend into, as the urgency shifts into the short term, that shifts into the medium and the long term, blend it into the energy transition story, which of course remains absolutely existential. And then the very final point that I wanted to raise is the revival of the idea of enlargement. As we moved from that age of idealism into an age of pragmatism, what happened was that enlargement, which of course was always a political project that very much belonged to that age of idealism, died in the age of pragmatism. It died because the liberal international order was going, because the EU had to simply focus on itself, because, especially also given, developments in Hungary and in Poland, the whole Visegrad story, the idea was, did we kind of make a mistake in the first place, right? I mean, there were all these legitimate and illegitimate questions that were being raised at the time that killed off, and of course, developments that were happening in the enlargement countries themselves, of course, first and foremost of which, Turkey's de-democratization, but also developments in Serbia, which kind of gave us cold feet. A number of reasons gave us cold feet. And in that age of pragmatism, enlargement as an idea died. As we now shift into this age of war, enlargement as an idea revives. Now, very concretely in the case of Ukraine, of course, the application by Georgia, by Moldova. But I think a fundamentally important question is, where does this leave the actual enlargement countries as well? What does this mean for the Western Balkans? What does it even mean for Turkey? How does the revival of an idea actually, presumably it will not simply take place the way it did in that first age of idealism. It will be made of different things. It will be driven by different forces. Which ones, I don't know, because the paradigm has changed. But I think that, in a sense, the genie is out of the bottle already. And I think it's up to all of us to see exactly how to give it meaning in the sort of months and years ahead. And I'll stop there.
Well, Natalie, thank you very much for this very sobering analysis, particularly for German ears. Well, I immediately turn it over to Andrássy, to you, and looking forward from your perspective, from an Hungarian, Eastern, Central European perspective. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Heinrich. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to particularly thank to all our audience who decided to spend a Thursday evening with us instead of speculating on the election outcomes or doing things that people usually do a few days before parliamentary elections. And thank you also, Natalie. I took 3.5 pages of notes, so I very much hope that you will publish this somewhere, so I don't have to decipher my own bad handwriting and trying to remember the things you said. I particularly liked this chronology, like age of idealism, followed by the age of pragmatism, transiting into an age of war from February this year. Particularly relevant is the age of pragmatism, which started basically from the war in Georgia. The war in Georgia in 2008, with which Russia could basically get away unscratched. I mean, after the war in Georgia, there were no sanctions introduced against Russia. Half a year later, the West was already talking about a reset with Russia under the Obama administration. And still, the war in Georgia was a turning point in the sense that there was such a war on the European continent, which actually changed national borders by force. And after Georgia, we seriously hoped that such a thing could never happen again. We really took it as a one-off, that okay, this happened. Many people put part of the blame on the then Georgian President Saakashvili and his kind of hot-headed approach with the war. And many of us were really sure that this was one-off. Anyways, Georgia was far away. This thing shall never happen again. Let's have a nice, convenient reset with Russia, particularly because back then Russia was led, at least officially, by a different president. This was the Medvedev era, the presidency of Dmitry Medvedev. By now, we already know that even the Medvedev era was dominated by Putin, but in the very beginning, this was not fully evident. So there were a lot of hopes. Most of these hopes were actually shattered in 2014, when the Russian occupation and illegal annexation of the Crimea happened. And again, European borders were changed by force. The Crimea was one step worse than what Russia did to Georgia. In Georgia, on the 29th of August 2008, Russia recognized the independence of the two separatist regions, but did not go any further. Back then in 2008, there was no annexation. In 2014, however, Russia already not only occupied, but also illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula and changed the European border by force, by annexing territory, which is something that Europe hasn't really seen since the Second World War. But even after the Crimea, some sanctions were introduced, albeit not that many. Remember, after the real serious sanctions did not come after the Crimea. Several other things had to happen, including shooting down including starting the war in eastern Ukraine, shooting down the Malaysian airliner, the Skripal case, the Navalny case, and a lot of other things. Solely the attack on Ukraine still did not induce serious sanctions. After the Crimea, a few Russian personnel and entity came under sanctions regime, assets freeze and entry bans, but really nothing devastating, nothing strategic. Russia had to misbehave even more, if you like, in order to generate or to force or to coerce Europe, or to make Europe to adopt finally more painful sanctions. Because we really believed in pragmatism. And we really believed that it's possible to segmentate between issues. And many believe that, yes, what's happening in Ukraine, it's in Ukraine, but it's still possible to cooperate with Russia on a number of other issues perfectly outlined by Natalie, ranging from Iran to climate issues. And yes, including Nord Stream. And Russians were very good, and this is a credit we need to give them. Russians were very good in making us believe that this kind of segmentation is possible. Russia did its best to convince us that, okay, what's happening, that Ukraine is a bit like Las Vegas. What's happening in Ukraine remains in Ukraine, and otherwise, we are perfectly happy to cooperate, and we are good and reliable partners, I mean, from Russia's perspective. And all this came to an end in February 2022. It was not the 24th of February, which brought the end. The end started a few days earlier, when Russia recognized again two separatist entities, the Donetsk National Republic and Luhansk National Republic, these two so-called separatist territories and separatist republics in eastern Ukraine, because this already induced landslide changes. Less than a day later, Nord Stream 2 was scrapped. After a decade of pragmatism, the new German government decided to give up its most important project regarding Russia, taking up all the financial losses, taking up all the political losses, and yes, taking up also the loss of face. Because for almost a decade, the argument was that Nord Stream is a purely business project, has nothing to do with Ukraine. Now the new German government demonstrated that yes, it has a lot to do with Ukraine. Actually, the situation in Ukraine brought Nord Stream 2 to an end. And we're talking here about billions of euros losses. A pipeline which is technically completed and operational. And still the decision was taken not to operate and find alternative solutions. And when the recognition was followed shortly by the all-out attack of Russia on Ukraine, this really brought the landslide change to European security, basically to all aspects of European security. And as a researcher, one needs to be a bit careful with too high words or too poetic words. But in this particular case, I think poetic words are actually the bad news. We are living historical times. This is going to be such a landslide in European security, like 9/11 was in global security. And we don't know where this whole thing is going. We see tracks, we see trends, but we don't see at the end. And, you know, I'm following this war on a daily basis. As a Russia specialist, this is the time when I always need to carry an extra battery for my mobile phone because of the phone calls. It's really like losing the energy, so one needs to recharge it. And still, it's kind of shocking to think back that it's only 6 weeks. Feels like an eternity, like since as if this war has been going on already for years, and it's only 6 weeks. And what has happened during these 6 weeks? I mean, this is such a scale of invasion, such a size of invasion, such a scale of military operations we have not seen in the European continent since World War II. In terms of size and scale, I mean, meaning the participating forces, this is way bigger than Yugoslavia was. The siege of Kiev, I mean, not yet urban combat, but artillery fire, airstrike, missile strikes. The siege of Kiev, dear colleagues, and Kiev, together with the agglomeration, is a city of 3.5 million people, 3.5 million. This is the largest European city under siege since the Second World War. Sarajevo was much smaller. Grozny was much smaller. And just really to feel the scale of things. When it comes to the refugee wave mentioned by Natalie, I just checked the numbers, the actual numbers preparing for this lecture. So the data basically from yesterday. More than 10 million people are already displaced, 1/4 of Ukraine's population. The number of refugees who already left Ukraine and came to the neighboring countries, almost all of them to the EU except Moldova, which is also doing a very important job in hosting these Ukrainians. Dear colleagues, 4 million people already left Ukraine in 6 weeks' time. This 4 million is 2 times larger than the whole 2015-2016 migration wave combined. And again, only 6 weeks. I cannot recall a single crisis which would have resulted 25% of a country's population flee in 6 weeks. Rwanda, perhaps. But this is, I mean, simply by the scale, it's absolutely unique. And when it comes to the very process of the war, many people perceive it as a Russia-Ukraine war. Bad news, it's not. Russia and Belarus are fighting against Ukraine. Yes, Belarus hasn't yet deployed boots on the ground, I mean combat forces to Ukraine. But short of that, Belarus is doing everything in this war on Russia's side. Russia's army is using Belarus's territory, airspace, and military infrastructure. The offensive on Kiev was actually launched from the territory of Belarus, from the Gomer region. Operations of the Russian Air Force in Ukrainian airspace are getting controlled and directed from Russian command and control aircraft operating from the Belarusian airspace. The Beriev A-50, if one needs the details. Russia has been launching artillery and missile strikes from the territory of Belarus. And Belarusian military is providing the Russian army with full logistical support as well as medical support. Belarus is fully involved in that. Yes, as of now, as of today, 31st of March, no Belarusian fighting forces in Ukraine's territory yet. But the most capable units of the Belarusian army are already lined up along the Ukraine-Belarusian border, starting from the Brest region towards basically Moshe. And even if they do not cross the border, and Belarus has serious problems with the combat capability of its armed forces as well as their willingness to fight, even if they do not cross the border, simply their presence forces Ukraine to divide its military strength, divide its forces. So simply lining up the Belarusian forces on the Ukrainian border, it bogs down considerably Ukrainian forces and distracts them from the defense of Kiev. So Belarus is participating in this war. So this is not a bilateral war, this is a tripartite war, Russia and Belarus against Ukraine. And even when it comes to the consequences, still just to finish up with Belarus, whichever way this war ends, any way this war ends at any time, it's already sure that the military integration of Belarus and Russia are going to get deeper. Russia is highly likely to keep up a lasting military presence on Belarusian soil, possibly establishing permanent military bases. Russia already had military infrastructure on Belarusian soil, a radar station and a radio transmission station, but those were not combat-capable forces. After this war, it's highly likely that Russian combat-capable forces will stay in Belarus. Air defense, as well as possibly nuclear-capable missiles, a lot of signal intelligence capabilities, and many other things. The lasting presence of Russian military in Belarus is going to alter the security and military defense calculus of whole Eastern Europe, including Poland and Lithuania particularly. If Russian forces stay there in Belarus, and most likely they will, for Russia, closing the so-called Suwalki gap, so connecting the territory of Belarus to Kaliningrad, would become much easier. The reaction time available for NATO will decrease to a few hours, not more. So this is already affecting Europe's security, Eastern Europe's security, also in the military sense. And the war itself in Ukraine, this is of course the most important effect, and how this is affecting Ukraine as a country and the whole region around Ukraine. Ukraine is quite likely to lose significant territories by the end of this war. Russia is highly likely to take the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, so more than 2 times more than the territories which the separatist entities controlled before February. Because the separatists have claimed the whole Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and Russia is supporting these claims. Russia recognized the independence of these republics, quotation mark. According to these large territories, Russia has already said last week that the objective is, again, quotation mark, to liberate the whole territory of Donetsk and Luhansk. So Ukraine is going to lose these 2 regions, including the heavy industry there, including the mines there, including the agricultural potential there, including everything. There is a possibility, quite a high possibility or high probability, that Russia will not give up the territories connecting the occupied Crimea to eastern Ukraine, the land bridge scenario, if you like. Because as of today, Ukraine has basically lost access to the Azov Sea. The port city of Mariupol, fighting is still going on in a few downtown districts, but it will soon be over. There is no way Ukraine could save Mariupol. The only Ukrainian forces that could possibly do that are actually retreating to the opposite direction. And when Mariupol falls, Ukraine will lose its access to the Azov Sea full and complete. It's quite unlikely that Russia would again allow Ukraine to get back the Azov Sea access. So this alters already the geopolitics of the region. It's yet unclear how much Ukraine is going to lose from its Black Sea shoreline. But anyways, Ukraine already lost its fleet. Ukrainian fleet was decimated already after 2014. When Russia took over the Crimea, Ukraine lost all of its large surface combatants, except of one, a frigate called Hetman Sahai-Dachny, which was actually chasing pirates in Somalia when the invasion happened. Later, this frigate became the Ukrainian flagship and served as the Ukrainian flagship and really the only large surface military ship. But in the beginning of this war, Ukrainians were forced to scuttle the ship, to sink the ship in order to prevent Russians from capturing it. The few remaining patrol boats of Ukraine were either destroyed or captured. There might be 2 or 3 left in Odessa, but not more. Ukrainian fleet basically ceased to exist. And this leads to the question, even if the war ends, what happens if Russia decides not to lift the blockade of Odessa? What would happen to Ukraine's shipping? What would happen to Ukraine's global trade? What would happen to Ukraine's agricultural export? Who would fight off the Russian blockade from Odessa? NATO surely not. Ukraine again surely not, because they will have nothing to fight with. So this already raises quite significant questions of global importance as well. And Ukraine as a country, as an economic system, as an industrial system, is now getting downgraded massively. If the war would end, if the war ends today, that's not what I said it won't. If the war ends today, the economic loss of Ukraine would be approximately 35% of the GDP or even more. The country's military industry is basically ruined. Russia is systematically destroying military industry as well as heavy industry. The longer the war lasts, the more Ukraine's industrial capabilities are going to be downgraded. We don't know how far it's going to last, but Ukraine will be a fundamentally different country also from the economic perspective once this war ends. And if we widen our scope, and that's my last point here, and start thinking about European security and relations with Russia, I fully agree with Natalie. This is the age of war. Illusions about possibilities of cooperating with Russia are gone, over. This is probably, if not forever over, but over for the next years, possibly decades to come. And from Russia's perspective, Russian soft power is also over. Dear colleagues, the whole concept of Ruski Mir, the Russian word, so all Russian speakers shall unite under Russia's leadership, under the third Rome, if you want to add kind of historical aspect. Now with the Russian army shelling full Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine, killing ethnic Russians in thousands, making them homeless in millions, shelling Kiev, one of the birthplaces of Russian culture. What kind of Ruski Mir is that? Who could, after all this, who could reasonably argue that Russian-speaking people shall unite under Moscow's leadership? So Russia is actually losing now its soft power, which will make Russia even more isolated from the rest of Europe. And Russia is losing its economic cooperation and economic ties to the West rapidly. There are 3 factors to count in here, not only the sanctions. We have the sanctions, that's one. We have the decisions of the other Western companies to voluntarily suspend their operation in the Russian market, that's two. And we have the responses from the Russian regime. And these three combined are affecting Russia's economy and their connection with the West. And the combined effect of these three factors is already devastating. And these three factors have a self-strengthening kind of spiraling effect. The more time flies, the worse it gets. Russian aircrafts made by Airbus and Boeing are already getting grounded because Airbus and Boeing are not servicing these aircrafts. Russia is already suffering from the shortage of microchips. Russia is suffering from the shortage of insulin. And this is of life importance for people suffering from diabetes. And the more and more such shortages are going to come as other sectors of Russian economy are suffering from the sanctions and getting on the brink of collapse. And one may argue, of course, that Russian army is showing its worst performance ever since Chechnya. Russian army is seriously underperforming. That's true. But this does not mean that they could not win by attrition. Simply by causing so much losses to Ukraine, that Ukraine might not be able to tolerate beyond a certain point. In this attrition logic, destroying civilian infrastructure, killing civilians is not a collateral damage anymore. It's an integral part of Russia's strategy to put pressure on President Zelensky and his government. And every day more fighting in the war, every extra day in the war raises the questions for President Zelensky: how many of my Ukrainian compatriots are going to die today? This is the way how Russia is fighting this war. This is again something we haven't really seen in Europe, at least since Yugoslavia, but possibly since the Second World War again. And effects in Europe, and I really finish here. Europe, I think, is rearming itself, and this is going to change the world also for ourselves, nice, well-lit, warm and cozy homes. Dear colleagues, simply Germany's decision to spend 100 billion euros more only this year on defense and to raise defense expenditures to 2%, this is already a landslide change. Yes, we all know the sorry state of Bundeswehr, so this extra money is not going to make Germany a military power immediately. But in 5 to 10 years, definitely yes. And it's not only Germany which is raising its military expenses. Poland already declared that they are raising their military expenses from 2% to 3% of the GDP. Many other European countries are going to follow suit. Moreover, Sweden and Finland are seriously considering joining NATO. This is something that was earlier unseen. So Europe is rearming itself. Europe needs to focus and will focus more on solidarity and collective defense. And within NATO, the focus will clearly be on collective defense even more than it has been since 2014. So all in all, I can only repeat what I started with. These are really historical times, and I really wish that they wouldn't, but unfortunately they are. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrássy. This has not been less sobering than Natalie's analysis. I see already the first questions coming in, but let me first give Natalie the chance to respond to some of the points Andrássy made. Natalie.
Yeah, I mean, more than respond, I thought it was absolutely fascinating what Andrássy was saying, but I really wanted to actually ask him a question. And the question is the following. Yes, you could indeed, see exactly the kind of scenario that you paint, both in terms of the cost that this would impose on Russia, as well as the perhaps even greater cost that this would impose on Ukraine, the implications that this would have on the Ukrainian state. But I guess my question really has to do with Russia itself internally. And here I'm not going in the direction. I know there's a question which is about, sort of popular upheaval in Russia. My question is in a sense, I guess perhaps in some respects even more dramatic, which is in a situation whereby you have a regime which has failed militarily, at least in terms of what the original objective of this invasion was. It will be failing economically for the reasons that you point, because, in a situation of an attrition war, in a situation of a, Ukrainian state, which is kind of, chopped off from the sea and to the east, presumably sanctions are going to remain in place, and that energy sort of independence that or maybe we'll be forced into it in the next few hours, but even if we're not, it will happen anyway. It's at this point I think the die has been cast. So in a situation in which that economic failure of Russia is going to exacerbate, and in a situation in which there's a fundamental ideological failure. I think, you made a really powerful point when you were talking about, basically the end of the Ruski Mir idea, precisely because of what is happening in Ukraine, and the way in which this war has been waged. So you have a sort of military and economic and an ideological failure. Are these not the ingredients for not necessarily an upheaval, but a collapse of the Russian state? This is, in a sense, a prospect that I think even beyond, the tragedy of Ukraine is, it's terrifying. And, this is a state which, has kind of collapsed twice in little over 100 years. So it's got a track record there, right? So, what knowing Russia so well, what are the risks there that you see?
Thank you.
András, take it up directly.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Henrik. Let me show you something about the possibility of collapse of the Russian state. I'm trying to share my screen. Now you are supposed to see some Cyrillic letters. This is the website of Russia's only independent remaining public opinion polling center, the Levada Center. And here you see how Russians judge the overall actions or activities of Vladimir Putin. And you see that the ones who actually support his activities, the number is skyrocketing. Before the war in February, 71% said that, okay, it's all right. Now it's already 83%. The numbers of those who disagree is declining. If you don't like the lines, here we have the numbers. So actually what we perceive here in Western Europe or Central Europe at the moment as a tragedy and as a landslide change, as a war that might change Europe and that might put Russia into the brink of a disaster. As of today, the Russian population, dominant majority of the Russian population sees it differently. This is very indicative. The same goes for the prime minister. The prime minister is always less popular in the Russian system. Also, the popularity of the prime minister is rising. Even the popularity of the government is rising. And if there is anything unpopular in Russia, that's the government. Still, we see the same skyrocketing. And this is not a public opinion polling center operated by the regime. Yes, it has to operate in Russia, but it's still as independent as it can possibly be. So we don't really see the public support. I stop sharing. The public support would disappear from behind Putin. It's quite the opposite. Public support is growing. So in the short run, I do not see that the Kremlin would be forced to change its policy course. In the medium, economic hardships are going to hit Russia hard in the medium and long run, not in the next 6 months. Yes, they lost some of their strategic reserves, but the other half is still available. They can play with the inflation. And after 2014 anyways, Russia has conducted an exceptionally prudent macroeconomic policy. Yes, the price was to inflate the ruble and basically burn the savings of the Russian population. but they could stabilize the country macroeconomically. Yes, they are going to have a recession. This is going to be the 4th year of recession ever since 2014. And the real wages have been constantly decreasing since 2014, but still this is not yet a breaking point. And should they get closer to a breaking point, I don't think that the state would collapse. This state is much stronger than any Russian state in the history has ever been. Much stronger, a lot more violent, and it knows a lot more about the Russian society than even the Soviet Union or the Tsarist Russia did. I mean, they have so developed social monitoring systems supported by artificial intelligence and substantial manpower and human resource and technical resources. They know every bit and piece of the Russian population. They very carefully monitor the moods of the Russian population and the actions of the Russian population. And they have the power to prevent any kind of upheaval, any kind of bottom-up change. And even if none of these would work, because some kind of a cataclysm starts happening, we only have 2 more years left until the upcoming Russian presidential elections. It's 2024. So one possible way for the Russian elite out of the crisis, one possible way of not removing but making the Putin regime change, is to convince the president not to run again in 2024. This would open the possibility for a nice, smooth, managed transition. No upheaval, no putsch, no shooting people back in the head, just a managed, proper transition. So even if things go really bad for Russia, and in the medium run they will, I don't see the possibility of any kind of upheaval or things turning upside down. The Russian elites will manage the change from within. And if Vladimir Vladimirovich will decide or will be motivated to decide not to run again, there won't be a democratic candidate. It never happened in Russia. The elite will choose somebody from their own ranks. Yes, some minor element of the system might change. There might be a Medvedev number 2, a bit more liberal, a bit less corrupted, a bit less violent, but fundamental changes is not going to take place. I hope this helps as an answer. Thank you again.
Andrássy, this skyrocketing support for Putin, for the prime minister, for the government, how much can this explained by the monopoly of information of the media? First question. The second question: how does the exodus fit in? Thousands of Russians leaving to Georgia, to Armenia, to the Central European countries. The trains arriving in Helsinki are filled with Russians who have a visa, who can easily move to the West. Is it just those small groups who have been critical all along and do not see a future for themselves in Russia anymore, but who do not see a different scenario than yours, that the country is not collapsing, the regime is not collapsing, that Putin is staying, so that they are basically giving up on their country and leaving? What do you think about this?
I think that you're absolutely right in both of it. The Russian regime has such a control over the media and information space that is unimaginable, even sitting in Budapest. So it's this, and I mean, for Putin, when he came to power, prime minister from 1999 and president from 2000, for him, the number one lesson, or one of the number one lessons he learned from the Yeltsin era, is that independent media is dangerous to the power. He started his rule, let's just remember, 2001, 2002, cracking down the strongest oligarchs who had their media empires, Boris Berezovsky and also Gusinski. It took him 2 years to crack down to both oligarchs, force them to flee abroad and take over the media empires. And the Putin regime has been perpetuating its control over the media for more than 20 years. It's a generation's time. This is an extremely complex and well-constructed system which allows to influence the population's decisions, to influence the population's information bases, and also allows, as I said, a very detailed monitoring of the population. So this information control, Heinrich, I 200% agree, it's a key element.
Mhm.
And when it comes to the Russians leaving Russia, this is a tragedy. This is really a tragedy. I mean, intelligentsia is leaving. People with higher education, people who have the flexibility, the mobility, and the skills necessary for leaving. And it's not easy to leave one's home under pressure. It's not easy to emigrate, and to emigrate when you really feel that you have no life there anymore. This thing is not a managed emigration. Do you know the numbers? 300,000 already.
Yeah.
In 6 weeks' time, 300,000 Russians left the country. Just to our audience, dear colleagues, just imagine packing your life and leaving for an infinite period in a few weeks' time. Really just imagine, would you be able to do it? What should happen to you which makes you which makes you do that?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the level of how serious the whole thing is. And me as a person, I'm fond of Russia, speaking the language, knowing the country a bit. I'm terribly sad. I mean, this is really a tragedy for Russia. It's not about the Putin regime. It's about Russia as a country. So that's my answer here.
Yeah, thank you. Let's move to the questions. The first question was about China and India. What kind of role do you see for China and India? Both have of course differently reacted to Russia's aggression on Ukraine, but both have not lined up with the West, particularly China. Or China is thought of more or less openly supporting Russia. For India, it's more the silent support, or it's more the knowledge that India is very dependent when it comes to defense, to military on Russian weaponry, and of course the traditional relations between India and Russia, and of course the tradition of bloc free head of the bloc free movement in the past. How do you see both Natalie and you, Andrássy, the role of China and India in this situation? Could both or one of them be a mediator, help ending this war, helping at least coming to a ceasefire? There was quite a bit of expectation that China could be in such a position. Now we see the only game in town, even if it's a very small one, is Turkey, surprising the NATO country. So how do you see the role of India and particularly China in this context? I don't know who wants to start first. Natalie, maybe?
I'll kick off.
Yes.
So I'll say something about India and China, but then I'll also say something about the rest of the world, because I think it's important precisely in the same logic. So I think, as far as China's concerned, in an ideal world, which we don't live in, well, China doesn't live in and Russia doesn't live in, this would have been a war over and done with in 3 days. And this would have been a big win for China. I mean, obviously for Russia, but it would have been a big win for China. It did not go this way. And so I think China's ambiguity is connected to the fact that politically it can't and it will not drop Putin, but economically it doesn't have an interest in an escalated war or even a protracted war. And so its ambiguity is because it doesn't want to tilt too much, either politically or economically, because it takes it in very different directions. I think you painted the India situation rather well. And I would say that when it comes, I think the India situation is also indicative, and here I make the connection to the rest of the world, of how much of the rest of the world looks at this. I was in Doha up until a couple of days ago. And it was, fascinating to have these conversations with, people from the Middle East, but there are also actually quite a few, Indians, Pakistanis, Asians, Africans. And I think, they do look at this as, in terms of kind of, their sense as to who's right and to who's wrong. I think they kind of got it, get it more or less right? But they feel very strongly that this is not their war. And so why should they pursue our same policies? We don't pursue necessarily their policies and their wars. And this leads me to, I think, a fundamental point, which is critically important for us as Europeans, I think, and we have a role to play in this respect that perhaps Americans do not, in how we manage this rest of the world, in the sense that I think that if, and given that everything that we've said so far points towards an age of war, which is not ending anytime soon, I think we have all interest in avoiding this being portrayed and being understood as a West versus rest war. I think we have all the interest in this being a West versus Russia, Syria, Eritrea, and Belarus, and then a gray zone of different shades of gray as part of the rest. But this depends on us. I mean, Russia will actually do everything it can to make this a West versus rest. If we overstep the mark in terms of expecting the rest of the world to pursue our policies, we will go in exactly the direction that Putin wants these countries to go. So I think, we have to, which, as, we're really on the cusp of this discussion, particularly when it comes to the EU-China summit. I think we have to play it very smartly because, yes, obviously we have an interest in trying to push the envelope as much as we can. But if we push it too much, it will boomerang back. And walking that line, I think, will be very difficult, but absolutely essential for us to walk.
Yeah, I agree, Natalie. But particularly Middle Easterners and North Africans should be concerned because countries like Lebanon and Egypt rely to 79 to 90% of wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine. And at least prices will go up. And we have seen bread crisis, bread rebellions in many countries. But you are absolutely right. It's also many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, and have not really made their decision or are hedging their bets. Well, from their perspective, it's logical. It's understandable.
Yeah, and we should not over push them because
Absolutely.
Otherwise we push them in the wrong camp.
Yeah, András.
Thank you. It's very easy to talk always after Natalie because I can say that I already agree. Thank you. Waiting for the next questions. Kind of a small thing to add. China was very supportive to Russia's agenda until the attack actually started. Remember when at the opening of the Beijing Olympic Games, President Xi Jinping basically reiterated all Russia's claim about NATO should withdraw, US shall refrain from deploying its forces to Europe. And basically, he just recited the Russia's claims about how European security should look like. But when Russia actually attacked Ukraine, the Chinese position has become a lot more careful and a lot more distanced. And when there was the voting in the UN about Russia's aggression against Ukraine and about condemning Russia's aggression against Ukraine, only 5 countries voted against it. Of course, Russia, North Korea, Belarus, Eritrea, and one more prestigious place like this. China did not. China did not vote against the resolution condemning Russia. My impression, and I'm not a China expert at all, I mean, I can find China on the map on my better days, but that's all I know. My guess here is that China is taking a wait-and-see position, particularly if Europe really cuts itself from the Russian energy resources. Russia will have to export its energy resources, particularly when it comes to natural gas. I mean, natural gas you cannot really store. You have to export it. And I think China has noticed the strategic opportunity here to become the #1 buyer of Russia's energy resources, but on a much lower price. Because Russia would anyways be in a very vulnerable position when it comes to energy exports, and China will not hesitate to utilize this vulnerability of Russia. So Beijing is going for Beijing's own interests, and I don't really see that China would be ready to take up any international repercussions, possibly sanctions, for the sake of Moscow. It's quite the opposite. China is watching very, very carefully the mechanism and content of the sanctions adopted against Russia, because China has its own territorial ambitions, and Chinese will not commit the mistake of not learning from what's happening with Russia. So that's my point on China. Thank you.
Well, and you see more or less the same on the energy front with India. India is currently buying oil from Russia at a huge amount to way below market price. So we have a question, Natalie, and both Andrássy as well on the Western Balkans. You touched upon it a little bit already during your presentation, but could you develop this a little further, particularly as we have a few West Balkan countries where you have seen pro-Putin, pro-Russian demonstrations?
Well, so I go back to the point that I was making about kind of, you know, the revival of the idea of enlargement. And I think it's absolutely essential to revive this idea, as I said, towards existing enlargement countries. Now, with some countries, it is easier than with others. So it's easier to do this with Macedonia as opposed to, you know, Serbia or for that matter, Turkey. And yet, I think that we should not just limit ourselves to the obvious cases. Yes, we should do it and, you know, sort of, you know, steam ahead with those countries. You know, what are we waiting for? Still not having moved ahead on accession negotiations with Macedonia and Albania. But I think, you know, we should really pause on the Serbia question and the as well as the Turkey question. I mean, I'm taking just the extremes, and I loop this back to the point that I was making earlier at a global level, but I think this also applies to the, you know, neighborhood level in terms of avoiding this becoming a sort of a West versus rest dynamic. And so I think that, yeah, I think Turkey is basically sort of, you know, one of these cases in which this logic really applies. I think, you know, Turkey's in a position which, well, firstly, it will have its own elections in 2023. We don't know what the results of those will be. I think that this war will have very serious repercussions in Turkey, politically speaking. You know, and at the same time, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that, again, we can't expect Turkey to be exactly on our same line because it is far more exposed than even countries like Germany or Italy when it comes to Russia. It's exposed in energy terms, it's exposed in economic terms, it's exposed in security terms, it's exposed on foreign policy terms. Just think about, you know, Syria or Libya. So Turkey can simply not do what and I think it's important for us to understand it. So I guess, you know, even as uncomfortable as it is, you know, even going all the way to the extreme of Serbia, where the instinct would literally be that of, you know, whatever, you know, telling them to sod off, right? I think that actually now is the moment to go exactly the other way. To try and break the dynamic that I think Putin himself is trying to fuel further.
Sorry, Andrássy.
Thank you, but I myself, I'm not a specialist on the Balkans at all. So here I would prefer to refrain from commenting simply because I don't have the expertise necessary for that.
Yeah, but there is one question which goes directly to you. and which makes you at the end talk about Hungary and about the Hungarian elections. So the question is, what has been the impact of the war on election campaigns and outcomes, in brackets, in Hungary?
Thank you. Nice and easy question with nothing at stake. Researchers love these types of questions, right? Irony putting aside, the war in Ukraine and in the wider context, the Russia policy has been the most important dividing line within the camp of Hungary's ruling party, within, among the voters of Viktor Orban. And while most of these voters are going to vote for Prime Minister Orban anyways, and we don't really have data, detailed public opinion polling on how particularly the war is affecting priorities, it has indeed put the incumbent government into a very, very inconvenient situation. Simply from the perspective of the Russia policy and its effects on Hungary and Hungary's relations with other parts of the world, the worst is yet to come. And election results really matter here. If Viktor Orban's government win the elections and all public opinion polling with different margins of error, but still forecast a victory for Orban, then contradictions related to Orban's Russia policy and the actual European security reality, these contradictions are going to become a lot more apparent. And from then on, Orban will probably be under pressure to start modifying his Russia policy. The reason why he's stubbornly not doing so at the moment is exactly because elections are coming. So he has to talk both to the pro-Russian segment of his voter camp and also the not that pro-Russian part of his voting camp. But this need for an Orwellian doublespeak, this will be over after the 3rd of April. And from then on, the next big thing in Hungarian domestic politics is going to be the local elections 2024. So the government would have a lot of time to gradually reorient its voting camp, possibly away from Russia. Still, until 3rd of April, until this Sunday, the same dual communication is going to continue. And thereafter, if Orban wins, the challenge will be how to manage the damage that has already been done on Hungary's diplomatic prestige, on Hungary's trust within the alliance systems, EU and NATO, and all the other things. If the opposition wins, there would be a fundamental change in the Russia policy, fundamental and immediate. Also, because changing the Russia, opposition would be, an opposition government would be in an extremely difficult situation with a lot of institutions of checks and balances still filled by Fidesz loyalists and all that. And in such a minefield that would await for opposition government, foreign policy would actually be full of low-hanging fruits. Making spectacular changes, it's very easy in foreign policy. You can do declarative foreign policy, you can start supporting Ukraine 200% full-fledged. You can make a lot of gestures, so you can quickly and easily demonstrate that you are different from the previous guys. So this is kind of, it's not a forecast, this is like assessing the two possibilities, the two possible outcomes. To put the thing short, or to kind of a summary, Hungary will definitely not be more Russia friendly than it is today. Quite the opposite is likely. Only the extent of this turn is the question.
Thank you very much. We are very rapidly approaching the end of our time. One last question, and to both of you, and to give you an opportunity for final answer, and would like to weave in a very long question we've got. We talked about the weakening of Ukraine, the dramatic loss of GDP. We talked about Russia's huge loss. But how much will be Europe? How much will we be weakened by this war, and particularly by what's to come after the war? 4 million of refugees. Nobody knows how long they will be staying with us. Will there be an opportunity to return very quickly. Will all of them be able to return? Probably those from Mariupol and those occupied territories, they might consider it preferable to stay where they are and not going back to a different place in Ukraine. So, and the huge deviation of funds from all different kinds of projects inside the European Union to defense. What does this mean actually for Europe, for us? Given these also very sober prospects, could we do as Europe, well, more to be more active, to find a way out of this conflict. So far, we have decisively, well, we have very strongly sided with Ukraine, and in my eyes, the only option we had as Europe. But at the end, we have to think about the years to come, and we had a 7-year period of frozen conflict in Ukraine. We have now a very hot conflict, and we could move back into a frozen conflict time, which might last for years. So the funds being deviated to defense and also well, helping particularly frontline countries to be more resilient will be a task for the next upcoming years. So just a final remark from both of you, Natalie and András, and then unfortunately we have to leave it with that for today. But I'm sure this topic will be with us for the next years. Natalie, you want to start?
Yeah, well, I'll be very brief. Sort of, you know, in my talk, I was highlighting how, you know, Europe first through the pandemic, then now through this war, is moving forward on areas like defense as opposed to migration, as opposed to enlargement, etc., because it refound a sense of unity and of solidarity. So to me, the million-dollar question is, are we going to be able to sustain that as we move in the weeks, months, and perhaps even years ahead, in which the economic costs are going to be significant for us? And to me, it's not economics qua economics, but the political implications of that economic cost. You know, and I don't have an answer to the question. Is that economic cost something that will revive nationalist populism in Europe? You know, that nationalist populism that has actually been taking quite a strong beating since the pandemic. Is that trend going to continue, or is it going to be reversed? And you can paint art, you know, you can sort of paint pictures in both directions. I don't know which one it's going to go, but I guess my bottom line in terms of what does this all mean for us is it will depend on us, and it will depend on what the politics in our countries are going to be within our union, because that is going to fundamentally determine whether we actually deliver on areas like the economy, like defense, like migration, or like enlargement. It will, you know, depend on whether we manage to sustain that level of unity that we found with the pandemic, and we found even much more now with this war. But sustaining it is not going to be easy.
András.
Again, Natalie, to my point, it's fascinating. The key word is sustaining this coherence we have. And to formalize it, whether sustaining itself can be leadership, whether solidarity can act as can be a leadership can have a leadership function in itself, whether solidarity enough will be able to make us sustain our commitments. Look at Germany. I mean, simply raising the defense budget and finally start spending properly on the Bundeswehr. This is a decade-long project, but there will be new elections in 4 years. Can we be sure that the next government will sustain the commitment? Can we be sure that other governments after other elections in Europe, when we have plenty of elections coming, one in France, for example, very soon, are we sure that the subsequent new coming European governments will be able to sustain these commitments? Bad news here. In the beginning of the war, the Russian calculus about the sanctions was that yes, we might have sanctions for a while, but thereafter Europe will give up and we will be back to business as usual. Personally, I think we shall not let them be right on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely, András. Thank you so much, Natalie and András. This was a great conversation, a great discussion. And I will take your line, Natalie. It will depend on us. And this is a positive note, and I would really like to end this on a positive note. So it's very much in our hands. It's not, of course, all in our hands, but it's also in our hands. So it's our politicians, it's us all to make the best out of this bad situation. Well, thank you again, and have a great day, a great evening in Rome. And András, we are looking forward to Sunday evening here in Budapest.
Indeed.
Thank you very much to you, to Beate, to Kovac, András, and to all our participants tonight. And have a great evening and take care. All the best.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you. Ciao.